Billionaire asks black waitress for financial advice as a joke, but her first words leave him completely speechless. "How about giving me some financial advice along with that water?" asked David Richmond, not even bothering to look up from his phone as he laughed at his own joke. The Chateau Laurent restaurant in the heart of Manhattan was known for catering only to New York's elite, and he was used to being treated like financial royalty. Keisha Williams paused, the crystal water pitcher suspended in midair. At 28, she had served hundreds of arrogant customers at this luxury establishment, but something in the man's dismissive tone struck a particular nerve. It wasn't just disrespect. It was the kind of casual contempt that people like him reserved for people like her. "Actually," Keisha said, her voice maintaining professional courtesy, while her dark eyes flashed with unexpected intensity, "I would invest 40% in emerging market ETFs focused on sustainable energy, 25% in medical technology stocks currently undervalued by the market, 20% in commercial real estate funds in secondary metropolitan areas, 10% in agricultural commodities as a hedge against inflation, and keep 5% liquid for arbitrage opportunities." The silence that followed was deafening. David finally raised his head, his condescending smile freezing on his face as he processed what he had just heard. This was not just any answer. It was institutional-level financial analysis, delivered with the precision of someone who knew global markets intimately. "Sorry, what did you say?" he muttered, now paying full attention to the woman he had seconds ago considered merely part of the decor. Keisha poured the water with fluid movements, as if she hadn't just demonstrated financial knowledge that rivaled Wall Street analysts. "You asked for investment advice. I just answered your question." The other executives at the table stopped their conversations, all eyes fixed on the scene unfolding. Michael Torres, a partner at Richmond Investments, cleared his throat uncomfortably. David Richmond wasn't known for being challenged, let alone by a waitress. "Where exactly did you learn about emerging markets?" David asked, his voice now laden with genuine curiosity mixed with disbelief. Keisha smiled, but there was something behind that smile that sent a strange chill down David's spine. "You'd be surprised what a person can learn when they don't underestimate the intelligence of others." The entire restaurant seemed to have stopped to watch. Waiters froze in the middle of serving, customers whispered to each other, and the maitre d'hotel watched nervously from the entrance. No one had ever seen David Richmond put in his place like that, and by someone he had tried to humiliate. For a moment, when Keisha walked away to serve another table, David watched her with an expression that mixed confusion, reluctant respect, and something that looked dangerously like fascination. There was something about this woman that didn't fit the role she was playing, as if she were hiding secrets far greater than anyone in that restaurant could imagine. While everyone else was still processing what had happened, Keisha maintained her perfect professional facade, but her eyes revealed a serenity that only exists in those who have weathered far worse storms and lived to tell the tale. If you're enjoying this story of intelligence overcoming prejudice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will show that underestimating the right people can be the most costly mistake anyone can make. Over the next 15 minutes, David Richmond did something that rarely happened in his privileged life. He paid attention to someone he considered inferior. Keisha's every move through the restaurant was analyzed with the intensity of a predator studying its prey, trying to decipher how a simple waitress had managed to articulate an investment strategy that rivaled the reports of senior analysts at his own company. "Michael," he whispered to his partner, "find out everything about this woman. Full name, background, where she went to school, who she worked with. I want to know even what brand of toothpaste she uses." Michael Torres nodded nervously. He had known David for 10 years and knew that when something piqued his obsessive curiosity, He wouldn't rest until he had all the answers. Do you think she's a corporate spy? Someone trying to infiltrate us? David shook his head, watching Keisha serve a table of Japanese executives with the same professional efficiency, chatting briefly in fluent Japanese before taking their orders. No. It's something different. More dangerous. What David couldn't accept was the possibility that he had completely underestimated someone. His $4.2 billion fortune had been built precisely on his ability to identify hidden talent and opportunities that others didn't see. The fact that a black waitress had demonstrated institutional-level financial expertise at his favorite restaurant challenged his entire belief system about social and intellectual hierarchies. When Keisha returned to check if they needed anything else, David was ready with his verbal artillery. "So Keisha," he said, reading her name tag with exaggerated deliberation, "I imagine you studied at Harvard or Stanford to gain all this knowledge about emerging markets, right?" Keisha smiled, but there was something sharp about that smile that made David uncomfortable. "Actually, I learned a lot by watching people like you make terrible decisions based on arrogance rather than data." The comment cut through the air like a blade. Michael choked on his wine, and David felt the blood rush to his cheeks. No one, absolutely no one, spoke to him that way, especially not someone who was there to serve him. "Listen here," David leaned forward, his voice low but laced with menace. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I've been working in this city for 15 years. I know everyone who matters in the financial market. If you were someone relevant, I would know." Keisha tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words with scientific care. "The interesting thing about people in positions of power," she said calmly, "is how you confuse visibility with competence. You assume that if you don't know someone, that person can't be relevant." David felt a rising anger mixed with something he refused to recognize as fear. "Are you trying to teach me a lesson in humility? A waitress?" "I'm just observing behavioral patterns," Keisha replied, clearing the empty plates with precise movements. "It's fascinating how certain types of people react when their assumptions are challenged." As she walked away again, David pulled out his cell phone and dialed a familiar number. "Thompson? It's me. I need you to investigate someone for me. Her name is Keisha Williams. She works at Chateau Laurent. I want everything: educational, employment, financial, criminal history, if there is any. And I want it yesterday." What David didn't know was that Keisha had worked as a senior quantitative analyst at Goldman Sachs for 5 years before her life fell apart. That she had developed trading algorithms that generated over $200 million in profits before being falsely accused of insider trading by her own supervisor, a white man who had stolen her job and needed a scapegoat when the SEC began investigating. The charge never resulted in a conviction. There was no evidence because she was innocent, but it was enough to destroy her reputation on Wall Street. No reputable firm would hire her after the scandal, and she had burned through all her savings on lawyers trying to clear her name. The waitressing job was temporary, a way to survive while she rebuilt her life away from the financial spotlight. But David Richmond had no idea that the woman serving his dinner had once managed client portfolios with net worths greater than his own. He didn't know that she still had contacts in boutique hedge funds, that she studied Asian markets as a hobby, that her hints about investments were based on analyses she did in the early hours of the morning using data she collected from sources he never dreamed existed. While David plotted to investigate her, Keisha discreetly observed his table, noting how he gestures when nervous, how Michael always agrees with everything he says, how they both treat employees with casual contempt. More importantly, she had overheard snippets of their conversations about mergers and acquisitions he was considering, information that could be extremely valuable in the right hands. "Mr. Richmond," said the maitre d'hotel, nervously approaching the table, "I would like to apologize if there was any misunderstanding with our employee. Keisha is new here. She may not have understood the proper protocols for serving customers of your caliber." David waved dismissively. "Don't worry, Pierre. Actually, I'm finding her educational." Pierre looked confused but nodded respectfully before retreating. David turned his attention back to Keisha, who was talking quietly with another waiter near the bar. There was something about her posture, the way she carried her head, that suggested a confidence that went far beyond her current job. Each new humiliation David tried to impose only strengthened something within her that he couldn't see, a quiet determination fueled by the very injustice he represented. What that arrogant billionaire didn't know was that every condescending word, every look of contempt, was writing his own sentence of defeat at the hands of someone who had learned to turn underestimation into a lethal weapon. 3 days after the meeting at Chateau Laurent, David Richmond had in his hands a report that confused him more than it clarified. Keisha Williams, 28 years old, no criminal record, a degree in economics from a second-rate community college, no previous experience in the financial market. On paper, she should be exactly what she appeared to be, an ordinary waitress trying to survive in New York. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to Michael Torres, who was reviewing the same documents in his office on the 47th floor of Richmond Tower. "No one develops that level of financial expertise by studying at night at a university that doesn't even have an MBA program." Michael adjusted his glasses nervously. Maybe she lied about her education? Or is she using a false identity? David shook his head. Thompson even checked her birth certificate. Keisha Williams exists, but it's as if her real life only began 5 years ago. Before that, there's almost nothing. What David didn't know was that at that very moment, 2 blocks away, Keisha was sitting in an inconspicuous cafe on the Lower East Side, her fingers flying over the keyboard of an old laptop. On the screen, detailed information about Richmond investments unfolded: financial reports, corporate structure, pending lawsuits, and something much more interesting: suspicious trading patterns that suggested insider information was being systematically exploited. "Found anything interesting?" asked a familiar voice behind her. Keisha smiled without turning around. "Hi, Marcus." Punctual as always. Marcus Chen sat down across from her, a young-looking Asian American with the experienced eyes of someone who had navigated the treacherous waters of Wall Street for longer than he appeared. A former colleague at Goldman Sachs and one of the few people who never doubted her innocence, he had become an independent consultant after quietly leaving the traditional market. "Richmond is investigating you," Marcus said bluntly, sliding a brown envelope across the table. "My contacts say he's obsessive. He hired Thompson and Associates, the same guys firms use for due diligence investigations." Keisha opened the envelope, finding copies of documents detailing exactly what David had discovered about her, or rather, what he hadn't discovered. "Perfect. He's seeing exactly what I want him to see." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You planned this from the beginning?" "Not exactly." Keisha closed her laptop, her expression turning more serious. "But when he humiliated me at that restaurant, I saw an opportunity. Men like David Richmond have a giant blind spot. They can't accept that someone they consider inferior could be smarter than them." Over the next few days, David intensified his personal campaign against Keisha. He began frequenting Chateau Laurent regularly, always requesting a table in her section, always asking seemingly casual questions about markets that no waitress should know about. His attempts to catch her in a contradiction became increasingly obvious and cruel. "So Keisha," he said one Thursday, interrupting her as she served a nearby table. "I read today that the Asian currency market is unstable. What's your take on the impact on commodities?" Keisha paused, pretending to consider the question with the care of someone trying to impress. "Well, I believe the volatility of the yuan is creating arbitrage opportunities in the rare metals market, especially considering the new trade agreements with Vietnam." David smiled with cruel satisfaction. "Interesting theory. Too bad Vietnam suspended those agreements 2 weeks ago. I imagine you don't follow the financial news as closely as you'd have us believe." The comment was calculated to humiliate her publicly, and it worked exactly as David had hoped. Other customers looked in their direction, some whispering among themselves about the waitress who thought she was a financial expert. Keisha lowered her eyes, seemingly embarrassed, and muttered an apology before quickly walking away. David leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Michael, who had witnessed the entire scene, looked uncomfortable. "That was a little harsh, don't you think?" "It was necessary," David replied coldly. "People like her need to learn to stay in their place." What David didn't know was that Keisha had deliberately given an incorrect answer, testing exactly how far he would go to humiliate her publicly. Every display of cruelty, every attempt to belittle her, was being mentally catalogued as evidence of his character. More importantly, her constant appearances at the restaurant allowed her to observe his habits, overhear snippets of phone conversations, and notice details that a man accustomed to being served would never imagine anyone would pay attention to. Like the fact that he always left his cell phone face up on the table during important calls, or that he discussed confidential business matters assuming that the help was deaf and invisible. On one such occasion, Keisha heard David mention a special project involving a hostile takeover of a medical technology company. The details were vague, but enough for her to start connecting the dots about suspicious movements in that company's stock in recent weeks. "He's setting up something big," she reported to Marcus during another discreet meeting. "And based on the trading pattern I've identified, there are at least 6 instances of possible insider trading over the past 2 years." Marcus whistled softly. "Those are serious accusations, Keisha. We need solid evidence." "I'll get it," she said, her eyes shining with a determination Marcus recognized from the old days. "Richmond thinks he's hunting, but he's become the prey. Every time he tries to humiliate me, every display of arrogance, he's giving me exactly what I need to destroy him." While David continued his superficial investigation of an interesting waitress, Keisha methodically built a dossier that could not only clear her name once and for all, but expose a web of corruption that extended far beyond Richmond Investments. Beneath the apparent humiliation, a silent force was preparing to turn the predator into prey in a way he could never anticipate. The trap closed on a Thursday, exactly 3 weeks after the first meeting at Chateau Laurent. David Richmond stood in his conference room, surrounded by eager investors, presenting the final details of the hostile takeover of the medical technology company that would be the deal of the century for Richmond Investments. "Gentlemen," said David, pointing to the charts on the screen, "our analysis indicates that Biotech Solutions is significantly undervalued. With our offer of $2.8 billion, we will have complete control of a company that is easily worth twice that amount." The Asian investors present at the meeting seemed impressed. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that justified the enormous resources they were prepared to invest through Richmond Investments. That's when the door to the room opened without warning. David looked irritated at the interruption, expecting to see his secretary with some minor emergency. Instead, he saw Keisha Williams calmly entering, no longer wearing her waitress uniform, but an elegant executive suit that completely transformed her appearance. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made everyone in the room turn instinctively. "But I believe there is some crucial information you need to know before signing any documents." David felt his blood run cold. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Security." "Don't worry, Mr. Richmond," Keisha smiled, placing a briefcase on the conference table. "I won't take long. I just came to clear up some misunderstandings about who I really am." Michael Torres, who recognized Keisha immediately, whispered something inaudible and grabbed his cell phone, probably trying to call security. But Keisha continued, unperturbed. "My name is Keisha Williams, but for 5 years I worked as Keisha Davidson, a senior quantitative analyst at Goldman Sachs, specializing in emerging markets and financial fraud detection." She calmly opened the folder. "I developed trading algorithms that generated over $200 million in profits before being falsely accused of insider trading by my supervisor, who, coincidentally, looked a lot like Mr. Richmond here." The room fell completely silent. David felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead. "This is ridiculous. You're a waitress. I've looked into you." "You investigated Christina Matthews," Keisha corrected, removing documents from the briefcase. "An identity I built after my reputation was destroyed on Wall Street. But while you thought you were hunting me, I was collecting evidence of your illegal activities." She placed a series of documents on the table. "Gentlemen investors, allow me to present evidence that Richmond Investments has been systematically using insider information for the past 2 years, violating SEC regulations on at least 15 documented occasions." "This is absurd." David stood up abruptly. "She's lying. She's a waitress with delusions of grandeur. A waitress who listened to your confidential phone conversations for 3 weeks, Keisha replied calmly. "A waitress who noticed how you always leave your cell phone face up during important calls, assuming that the help is deaf and invisible." She turned on a laptop she had brought with her. "For example, this recording from the 15th, where you discuss with your accountant how to mask the source of insider information about the Meridian Corporation merger." David's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "No matter how you justify it in the books, just make sure they can't trace it back to our source at the SEC. If anyone finds out we knew about the merger 2 weeks in advance." David's face had taken on an unhealthy pallor. The investors looked at each other nervously, some already closing their folders. "But wait, there's more," Keisha continued, her voice maintaining its professional tone as she systematically destroyed his reputation. "These are copies of emails between Richmond Investments and Biotech Solutions, dated 6 months ago, long before any independent analysis justified this acquisition." The evidence piled up like an avalanche. Compromising emails, call logs, suspicious transactions, a clear pattern of market manipulation that spanned years. Each document was a stone carefully placed to build an insurmountable wall of criminal evidence. "How did you gain access to?" David began, then stopped, realizing he was incriminating himself. "You underestimated what a simple waitress was capable of," Keisha replied. "Every time you publicly humiliated me, every display of arrogance, you were giving me exactly what I needed to expose your operation." Mr. Yamamoto, the leading Asian investor, rose slowly. "Mr. Richmond, is this true?" David tried to regain his composure. "It's an elaborate hoax. She's trying to blackmail us or something." "Blackmail?" Keisha raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Richmond, I have already handed copies of all these documents to the SEC, the FBI, and 3 different financial journalists. The Wall Street Journal is scheduled to publish the lead story tomorrow morning." The statement hit like a bomb. Michael Torres dropped his phone. Investors began murmuring among themselves in various languages, clearly alarmed. I also took the liberty of informing the Biotech Solutions Board of Directors about the unauthorized communications. I imagine they will be fascinated to learn that your hostile takeover is actually a criminal conspiracy. David clung to the table, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. You've destroyed everything. I've exposed the truth, Keisha corrected. The destruction is a consequence of your own choices. Every crime, every manipulation, every act of arrogance, it's all documented here. David's phone began to ring incessantly. Probably journalists, authorities, or angry investors who had already received the evidence. His career, his company, his reputation, everything was falling apart in real time. But why? David asked, his voice breaking slightly. Why do this? Keisha looked at him with a serenity that was more devastating than any anger. Because men like you believe they can humiliate and destroy people with impunity. Because you saw a black waitress and automatically assumed she was inferior to you in every way. She closed the folder, her work complete. But mainly because someone needed to prove that underestimating the right people can be the most costly mistake you can make. As investors rushed out of the room, canceling contracts and cutting ties, David Richmond remained seated, watching 15 years of financial empire building crumble in a matter of minutes. The woman he had tried to humiliate had become the architect of his own destruction, using every act of contempt as ammunition for a revenge as precise as it was devastating. Outside Richmond Tower, Keisha called Marcus. It's done. The evidence is in the right hands, the press has the story, and Richmond has just realized that he is no longer the predator in this situation. The real question now was not whether David Richmond would survive the scandal, but whether he would understand that his downfall had been orchestrated by someone whose intelligence he had been too arrogant to recognize until it was too late. 6 months later, Keisha Williams sat in her new office on the 35th floor of a midtown skyscraper, a spectacular view of Manhattan stretching out before her. The plaque on the door read Williams Financial Consulting, CEO and founder, and her company had already attracted 3 of the East Coast's largest investment funds as clients. The Wall Street Journal had featured her on its cover, the analyst who toppled an empire, how a former waitress exposed billions in fraud. Job offers came in daily, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, BlackRock, all wanting to hire the woman who had demonstrated a unique ability to detect sophisticated fraud. Marcus Chun, now her partner, entered the office carrying a glass of champagne. David Richmond's final sentence just came down. 15 years in prison, plus $2.8 billion in fines and restitution. Keisha nodded calmly, looking out the window. Across town, she knew David was probably in his cell, reflecting on how a simple waitress had orchestrated his complete downfall. Richmond Investments had gone bankrupt, his investors had abandoned him, and his mansion in the Hamptons was being auctioned off to pay legal debts. You know what's most ironic? Keisha said, turning to Marcus. He truly believed that humiliating people was a sign of superiority. It never occurred to him that each act of contempt was providing exactly the motivation necessary for his own destruction. The irony was delicious. David Richmond, who had built his career by underestimating others, was defeated precisely by someone he considered irrelevant. His racial and social arrogance was not only morally repugnant, it was strategically suicidal. The phone rang. It was a journalist from Forbes, wanting to do a story on her methodology for detecting corporate fraud. Universities were offering her tenured professorships. 3 publishers wanted to publish her autobiography. Keisha Williams turned 3 weeks of waitressing at Chateau Laurent into the biggest financial fraud exposure of the decade, the journalist had written. Her ability to maintain her composure under discriminatory pressure while secretly gathering devastating evidence redefines what it means to turn adversity into strategic advantage. Pierre, the restaurant's maitre d'hotel, had called the week before. "Miss Williams, we would like to name a dish after you. Perhaps something about justice served cold." Keisha laughed at the memory. Even Chateau Laurent was capitalizing on her story, attracting curious customers who wanted to dine where the billionaire waitress had worked. David Richmond, meanwhile, had become a complete pariah. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid him. His Twitter account had been suspended after a series of bitter posts about false accusations that only strengthened the evidence against him. His ex-wife had filed for divorce, taking half of his remaining assets. "The best part," Marcus noted, "is that he created the very monster that destroyed him. Every public humiliation he imposed on you strengthened your determination to expose him." Keisha smiled, remembering the exact moment when David sarcastically asked for financial advice. He thought he was toying with a helpless victim. In reality, he was feeding a predator far more intelligent and patient than he could ever be. The story had become legendary in financial circles. Lectures on the Richmond syndrome, when arrogance and prejudice blind executives to real threats, were given at business schools. The case became a mandatory study on how underestimating people can literally be the most expensive thing anyone can do. Keisha opened the drawer, pulling out a framed photo, her serving David at Chateau Laurent, captured by a customer who had posted it on social media. It was a daily reminder that real strength doesn't need to shout. It whispers, observes, and strikes with surgical precision when the moment is perfect. David Richmond tried to humiliate a waitress, but ended up creating his own nemesis. Keisha learned that true revenge isn't repaying the damage done. It's achieving success her enemies could never imagine. If this story has inspired you to never underestimate the power of intelligence over arrogance, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that the right people, at the right time,